Hello! It's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Understanding Politics video. So this one is about coups, revolutions, and civil wars. In general, societies and governments fail in very predictable ways. It doesn't really seem to matter the system of governance or the economy or who's in charge. Every crisis, or at least every series of crises, seem to end in a very predictable fashion in one of these three events, with the sole caveat being democratic governance, which I will touch on at the end of the video, which has a quasi fourth one of these, so it's not crystal clear if it should be considered different. But I'm touching on that at the end. The three main ones, though, obviously we have coups, revolutions, and civil wars, and these are three very different events that are often lumped together, but why they happen, who they happen to, and what they do are quite different. So I will touch on this first before I get into the democratic stuff, just so we have a foundation of what these events are. The first one is the coup. The humble coup is, generally speaking, the most sudden, unpredictable, and least violent form of a government failure. And essentially, it's when a small faction of the establishment decide to topple the existing government. Usually, coups happen in relatively poor countries, relatively resource-rich countries, and almost rarely in almost never in functioning democratic countries. A coup in a democratic country almost entirely only occurs when, for the lack of a better term, people don't believe on elections anymore, that the elections will solve the problem. And in that case, then a coup could occur, but this becomes quite rare. It takes a very degenerate form of a system of government for this to occur. But the three most common types of coups, this is an exhaustive list, there's all sorts of coups you can probably find online of different categories of coup, but these are the three main ones. The likely historically most common, though albeit less common these days, form of coup is the palace coup, where effectively the monarch is overthrown by another member of the royal family because of either jealousy, they don't like that guy, the current monarch, or whatever reason. That's typically what happens, though it can also be the case that a really popular general overthrows the current king. That can happen, though that usually doesn't succeed, at least without causing a civil war, which I will get on in a moment. Now, in modern democratic systems, there is a quasi-new form of this, where it's kind of re-emerging, where the democratic leader of a political party, the one that has been selected by its membership, in the last agreed-upon method of selecting a leader, is tossed out or forced out by other members of the party establishment who are not content with their leadership, for whatever reason. Now, this happens semi-regularly, though oftentimes it's not extremely clear that it is actually a palace coup, though I think the most recent example of this was quite recently in September, when Liz Truss, the lawfully selected leader of the British Conservative Party, lawfully as in by their own criteria, and she was tossed out of the curb after a few bad polls came out, and replaced by Rishi Sunak by the Conservative Party establishment without consultation of the Conservative membership, consultation with voters, or really anything else. Now, officially she resigned, but in reality everyone knows that she was kicked out, and there was a palace coup in that the alternative for her resigning was a more embarrassing form of this, so it's a face-saving measure. That's usually how these get obscured, is that the person being cooed is told behind closed doors you are being couped, so either you resign and save face, or we just throw you out openly. Now, what is usually what is conflated with a coup is what we get. Oh, sorry, I'm missing one. I forgot the example of the palace coup. There's a classical palace coup. The best example to me, there's oodles of these actually, is Catherine the Great here, where she overthrew her husband because she thought he was not fit to rule, possibly even an idiot. And she became the Tsarina of Russia. Now, Russia in this 18th century, when Catherine became the Tsarina, had oodles of these. There was just so many palace coups in the Russian Empire. It was a bit ridiculous, actually. Possibly one of the reasons why it had almost zero revolutions compared to how long it existed, or very little civil strife. Most civil strife was just coups from the palace. But then we get on to what I think is often considered the main type of coup, but I think this is erroneous because this is actually a fairly rare type of coup in reality. While military coups are very notable, they happen seemingly quite a bit these days, or at least not necessarily these, but in the last 100 years. They are a more rare type of coup, just historically speaking, because the only way for a military coup to happen is to have a semi-hands-off military that has its own structure, and the generals in it are allowed to get enough notoriety and power among the service members that they could harness the loyalty of the service members to do a coup. Now, it's not historically unheard of. There's plenty of these in the Roman Empire. But between the Roman Empire and about the 1900s, there really wasn't any of these. They seem common, mostly from a recency bias. But I'm going to give my illustrative example of a military coup, which would be in Chile with Augusto Pinochet. Effectively, the government of Chile was deemed, quote-unquote, too communist by the U.S., and Pinochet, with support of the U.S., decided to overthrow the Chilean government. Now, was it actually communist? I don't really know. I don't really care. But that was the U.S. justification, and Pinochet, quite infamously, or famously, depending on your perspective, liked throwing communists out of helicopters into the ocean at night. So, there definitely was at least a lot of animosity there. He is a very principal example of this because, he was a military general in the Chilean military, and he overthrew the government with help of the military. So, classic example of the military coup. Now, finally, we get on to the last main type of coup, and we get the self-coup. Now, the self-coup is probably the rarest and most edge case of a coup. It is technically a coup in every sense of the word, but it almost doesn't feel like it should be a coup because it's very different motivation. Whereas the palace coup or the military coup is concerned with overthrowing the existing government to replace it with a new one, the self-coup is interested in overthrowing the existing, for lack of a better term, constitution and replacing it with a different one, usually centralizing more power into the figure of the coup-ee. Usually this entails a popular president and a presidential republic overthrowing themselves and becoming a dictator or a monarch, or sometimes, if they are losing an election, they coup themselves so they don't lose an election anymore, and they become dictator, usually. The best example of this, I would say, is Napoleon III here. He was lawfully elected in the French election in 1848, following the overthrow of the July monarchy, and after about 3 years, where Parliament has, or well, we'll call it Parliament, the legislature obstructed him in every way, shape, and form, and he didn't feel like he could get his agenda done. He was just like, but what if I overthrow it? And he did, and then he became emperor in 1851. So that it is like the illustrative example of this. Someone who's in power, who has the trust of enough of the establishment, usually the military, decides, well, I could be king. That's usually how the self-coup works. Now we will touch on revolutions. Now, revolutions are a much more nebulous concept. The basic form is it's a movement of people, whereas a coup is a movement of the elites. But this is not really a satisfactory distinction, because oftentimes coups, such as Napoleon III's, are with the backing of the people. The people supported Napoleon III. That's how his coup succeeded. That's why it didn't get opposed by the legislature. They did not have the approval of the people. And that's usually how successful self-coups work, is the people support the couee in doing the coup. Not always, but usually. So it's not a very clear distinction between a revolution and a self-coup, or any other type of coup. But I think the best way to understand this difference, though it is a fuzzy line, is that a revolution is a movement of people in general, whereas a coup is a movement of a person. That's why Napoleon's self-coup isn't a revolution, but the 1848 revolution in France is a revolution. The 1848 revolution in France, or any other revolution in France, occurs because the people are dissatisfied with the status quo and they want to replace it. Whereas something like a self-coup or any other kind of coup occurs because an elite is dissatisfied and has supported the people. It's a very subtle distinction, but it is an important distinction. Now, the other thing with revolutions, which can cause these two, part of the muddying the water here, is most revolutions have a figurehead or several figureheads, the leaders of it, the people who are channeling the forefront of the revolutionary energy. The prime example of one of these figures is Maximilien Robespierre in the classic French Revolution of 1791. He becomes really the face of the French Revolution. He's largely the leader of it, though unlike a coup, he's the leader because he is pushed to the forefront, not because it's his ideas. In other words, when Maximilien Robespierre gets guillotined in about 1794 following the Thermidorian reaction, the French Revolution doesn't stop. It wasn't a movement from Robespierre. It was a movement that pushed Robespierre to the front because Robespierre agreed with the values of the French Revolution, and through his own natural qualities rises to the top of the French Revolution. But once the revolution had devoured Robespierre, the revolution continues. And that's the distinction. The revolution doesn't care about any particular individual leading it. And this is why usually they do not ever end the way the people starting them wanted them to end. Because while individuals can precipitate the revolution, it is exceedingly difficult to control the revolution, because the revolution isn't about people, it isn't about leaders, it is about ideas and the people. Now, there is a distinct subcategory of revolution. What I just discussed is really the popular revolution. It is the people attempting to overthrow the government. The main, very distinct form of this, though, which is almost shouldn't be considered the same thing, but it has been up until now considered the same phenomenon, so I will distinguish it just by adjective instead of coining a new term, but it's the secessionary revolution. Now, the secessionary revolution shares the quality of the popular revolution that it is a movement of the people against a government, in this case, to break off and form a different country. But there is a qualitative difference too. Whereas the popular revolution tends to have this quality of devouring its own leadership, such as in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, 100 years later, 200 years later, really. Well, 140. The successionary revolution, at least when they occur, usually isn't about ideas or values. It's about the people. The American Revolution here, as personified here by George Washington, is the best example of this. The American Revolution was the colonists in the U.S. dissatisfaction with the crown in England and the unrepresentativeness of the English Parliament manifest in separatism. They wanted to leave the United Kingdom because they did not feel represented by it. In this regard, figurehead leaders such as George Washington, who are leading and channeling the revolution, do not really have the fear that a Robespierre should have. Whereas the Robespierre is pushed to the front of a revolution because at that moment, his ideas are the ideas of the revolution, which might change or evolve, or his might change or evolve. The successionary revolution pushes to the forefront usually the person who is the ideal of the people separating. In this regard, George Washington is the classic example of this kind of revolution and why it is very distinct and different. George Washington doesn't become the figurehead, the leader of the American Revolution because he has the ideas or because he is the most preeminent member of society. In fact, you might even argue that he's not even reasonably the idea guy. The James Madisons, the John Adams, the Thomas Jeffersons, they're more of the idea guys of the American Revolution. You could argue Thomas Paine too if you want. George Washington, though, is the leader of the revolution. He's the figurehead. He's the unifying force behind it because he is perceived to be the ideal that the Americans held themselves to. He's the most virtuous man there, at least in the eyes of the U.S., or at least the American revolutionaries. That is why he becomes the leader. And it's also why, in regards like this, these revolutions usually end better than popular ones. It is not just a distinction that the leadership in charge is more virtuous. It's that almost necessarily they are more virtuous. The only way these governments, these revolutions win is because the figurehead leadership of them is something that unifies and rallies all the people in the country, in the nation. That does not happen unless the leadership is universally loved, or at least universally respected, which is not something the popular revolution has, usually. Well, with this, we get on to the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is a very different thing to the other two. In fact, I would argue civil wars don't happen on purpose. Civil wars are the result of a coup or a revolution failing, but not catastrophically failing. So in that regard, or to clarify that, to expand on that. You have a coup or revolution occur. But the coup or revolution is not strong enough to overthrow the central government. But it's not weak enough that the repulsion of the central government surviving ends the violence. For example, pardon me for that. The most recent example is the Syrian civil war. Now, I can't really tell you, at least yet, if the Syrian civil war was started by a revolution or a coup. I think you could kind of argue either at the moment, depending on your perspective. I think there was a popular movement, but I also think it might have been a failed military coup. It's not very clear to me. But what matters there isn't that if it was a failed revolution or a coup, but that there was a failed attempt to overthrow Assad. And Assad survives this, but the rebels are too powerful to be dismissed. They have enough organization and enough military strength to fight back. And this causes the civil war to occur. Now, to give a really good example, another really, really good example, I think this is the classic example, really, because this one's more clear to me, the events that happened, is the Spanish Civil War with Franco. What happened in the Spanish Civil War is there was a military coup against the Republican government, attempting to overthrow it because they didn't like what it was doing. And at the end of the day, it failed. It could not successfully coup the government. The plan of the Spanish phalangists, we'll call them that, wasn't to have a civil war. No one wants a civil war. Civil war is a disaster because it destroys the country you're trying to take over. It is the epitome of failure. But the coupping faction has two options when they fail their coup, such as the phalangists in 1936. Either you flee or you fight, because if you surrender, you die. You'll be executed. And in this regard, the Spanish Civil War, the phalangists had enough military strength, both domestically from the military, from the regions and volunteers supporting them, and in foreign support to continue persisting the fight and eventually win the Civil War and become the leader of Spain. And Franco became dictator for, 40 years, give or take? That is the trajectory of a civil war. With one notable exception, though. Succession revolutions that fail are usually coined as civil wars in historiography, which is a bit strange, but it seems to be the case. The best example of this is Jefferson Davis here with the U.S. Confederacy and the American Civil War. By all accounts, the Confederate States of America were a successionary movement. They did not want to be part of the U.S. They were not trying to overthrow Washington. They were trying to leave and form a different country based off of different values. One of these values being slavery. But this revolution ultimately fails because the American government under Abraham Lincoln doesn't want it to succeed. And they fight tooth and nail to stop it. So at the end of the American Civil War, as what we call it now, the Confederate States are defeated and are re-annexed, or at least denied succession from the U.S., depending on how you want to rephrase it. And it failed. So in that regard, the American Civil War is a civil war in that it is a failed revolution that leads to a full military conflict. But it's not failed in the sense that the revolution failed to overthrow the government. It is failed in the sense that the revolution failed to militarily defeat the government. That makes sense. There's a distinction. They were never trying to overthrow Washington. They were trying to fight Washington to get it to stop fighting them. Now, there is a corollary to all this. These are the classic ones that have existed probably since time immemorial, especially since the existence of the printing press. But in modern day, we have what I think we can clearly say is a different type of revolution. I'm calling it a revolution just because it seems better fitting than the other ones, but we could coin a different term if we wanted to. But it's what I'm going to call the democratic revolution. And the democratic revolution is born out of the nature of a functioning democratic system. It's very difficult to harness popular discontent strong enough to want to militarily overthrow a democracy. The reason for this is a proper functioning democracy with free and fair elections has a consistent relief valve for any pressure and dispossession that could cause a revolution. People who are unhappy have the ability to vote out the government and vote in someone they like. And as long as they perceive it as free and fair, this stops pretty much any amount of pressure from building. Though the important thing is perceived. You could have a system that is free and fair. The most free and the most fair, even. But if people don't think it's free and fair, regardless of whether that's true or not, that makes the relief valve no longer work. Because at the end of the day, elections are basically just function off of belief. The only reason why democratic government works is because people believe that it should work. There is no intrinsic reason why the prime minister of a government should step down because some other prime minister was elected. If they have support of the police and military, there's nothing that can be done about this. They can stay as prime minister. Now, you could argue they're a dictator now, but there is no intrinsic reason why you should step down in that state other than the people in the country believe in the myth of the democratic state more than they like you. So in that regard, you can't just become a dictator in a democratic state. You can't just self-coup yourself unless people no longer believe in elections. As long as elections are believed in, the state cannot fail in that way. But democratic states still experience a very related phenomenon. It's not a popular revolution. It's the democratic revolution. Now, unlike the popular revolution, it doesn't involve overturning the status quo with violence. It's not people showing up in Ottawa with rifles and shooting Justin Trudeau. That's not what a democratic revolution is. That would be a regular revolution. That's not what this is, though. What this is it's the population has been possessed by a different ideology than what is currently the default governing ideology of the jurisdiction. And this causes a peaceful seizure of power through peaceful democratic means. Effectively, the state apparatus stays the same. The governing philosophy has changed. There is no violence, there is no conflict, there is just elections and the natural progression to a different worldview in government. So, in a politically stable state, what usually happens is that a single party, or at minimum, a single worldview, if there's a succession of parties, tend to dominate the legislature. Now, if you have elected executives, that might be different. If you look at the US recently, that is a prime example. Since 1935 in the US, there has been the Democrats have controlled Congress about 70% of the time, or at least the House of Representatives 70% of the time. Also the Senate, but not at the same time. But they've controlled both the House and the Senate distinctly 70% of the time, but it's about 50-50 in presidents. That's just one example. But during one of these political status quos, you generally see about 67% average across all the countries. Now, it can be quite difficult to compare because different countries are going to function slightly differently, because it's not every democratic country at once has an event that causes a different ideology to take over. It depends on the country, depends on the leadership involved, but it tends to happen every little bit. And when you have the new status quo, that tends to be about 67%. And usually during these periods of domination, you'll see the media often say that this is the default party. This is the one that's always going to win an election. In which case, yes, that is probably the correct way to look at it. Now, just to go on, to give two very clear, specific examples. So we start off here with the United States. Now, I only have 1855 to 2025 here, but you'll have to believe me when I go earlier. So there's roughly 3 periods in the U.S. So you have 1800 to 1860, and that was primarily the Democratic Republican Party controlling the U.S. between the House and President and Senate and such, primarily. Then you have here about, 1865, give or take, to 1935 here. It's primarily the Republicans governing. As you can see, in the House, there is just, 22 years in that 90, or that 70, where the Democrats controlled the House, and even fewer in the Senate. Then 1933 to, or 35 to present, or 33, sorry, 1933. Confusing this with the next step, the next example. 1933 to 2025, we see a very similar case. The Republicans have only controlled the House for 26 years in the last 90. In the Senate, they've only controlled, again, 26 years in the last 90. This is what it means to be the status quo. This is the natural governing party. It does switch. It seems about every 90-ish years, though, again, end dates and start dates don't always line up. Another example, we have Canada here. This is a less ideal graph, I will admit, but I think you can generally see the point, so we're going to roll with it. Maybe I should have made my own graphics, but whatever. You kind of see here from 1867 to about 1930-35, depending on which election you want. Well, the 1935 election, really. The Conservatives seem to be the dominating party in the House. It's not as dominant as either U.S. example, but it seems to be the dominant case. And then we get 1935 to about present, and we have a very different situation. The Liberals are winning most elections. In fact, I believe they've won 71 of the last 90 years of elections. Or is it 80, 65? Don't recall. It's about 67% of the last 90 years, something like that. So we get this kind of event. It seems this is... Now, I will be very clear on this note here. What I'm about to say isn't prescriptive. This is just a descriptive claim of what happens in democracies. I cannot tell you why this happens, per se. I can tell you that it does seem to happen, though. Now, it seems to me that it's roughly about every 4 generations, give or take, that one of these democratic revolutions happen. In other words, one full generation cycle. Typically, people live about 80 years, so you you have your 0 to 20s, and you have your 20 to 40, your 40 to 60, your 60 to 80. One cycle like that, from someone going 0 to 80, seems to be when the democratic revolution happens. And if you have read or heard anything about Strauss-Howe generation theory, to me this seems the core cause of this. At least, it seems to line up really nicely. Again, I can't objectively prove this to you, but again, this seems to be what happens. So, in Strauss-Howe generation theory, there is, to really simplify here, because I don't want to describe the whole theory so far, or in this video, there is 4 core generations. You have the crisis generation. You have, what are they? Give me one moment. Okay, I've returned. So, yeah, you have approximately 4 generations that alternate in a predictable pattern. You have the high generation, where the culture is at its highest point, very conformative, generally very prosperous. You have the awakening generation, where social norms kind of break down, but it's still prosperous. Then you have the unraveling, where the prosperity is falling and social norms are basically gone. You have the crisis generation, where there's no social, social society is collapsing and economically it's collapsing. And then you restart, you go back to the high. Basically, it's this predictive pattern. Pardon me, I just hit the mic there. You can read more into it. I'm not going to describe it in great detail here. If people really want a big description of it, let me know, and I can go into it. But this is the general gist of it. So it seems to me that this pattern seems to be the cause or the driving factor here. Notably and specifically in that the democratic revolution occurs in the middle of the crisis generation, and that new status quo goes until the middle of the next crisis generation. Just scrolling down here to give you some examples. So we have here, this is the US. This is a US-based theory, but I think it is applicable everywhere because it's not specifically just talking about Americanisms. It's talking about generational turnover, which should happen everywhere. But we can discuss that another time. So you see here, you have the 1790s to the 1860s, and that's one period. The initial Democratic-Republican consensus likely starts sometime in the middle of this during the American Revolution. That doesn't get formalized until around here, and then it goes on until the Civil War. Then we have the Civil War, where the new Republican consensus starts emerging. As you can see with, I think, Lincoln was second place in the 1856 election as the prime example of this. And it goes again until the middle of the silent generation, the fourth crisis, the Great Depression kind of things. It goes into the middle of this. And in the middle of this, till about the middle of present, seems to be the Democratic consensus in the U.S. And now we seem to be entering a period where the Republicans are taking over. Especially if you go back to here. Was that the wrong one? You go back to here, you can kind of see there's more Republican control these days. So it looks like they might be reasserting as the dominant party in the U.S., but again, it's a bit early to tell. This seems to be what happens. There is some explanation as to why here with the Strauss-Howe generation theory, but it's not universal in that I don't know if this is a predictive, or well, it is predictive, sorry. I don't know if this is this is best described as a descriptive thing. This seems to be what happens in politics. There might be several reasons we can speculate on this, but I can't really prove these reasons. These just seem to be what I would call the reasons. These seem to be correlative. I will say, in that what sparks these turnovers of different political dynasties and different political systems, what sparks the democratic revolution, it's underneath is powered by this turning of generational cycles. At the very end of the day, what causes the turnover is corruption, age turnover, as I just said, and complacency. It seems a political movement that's been in power for a long time, an ideology that's been in power, the members in it get complacent. If you have a dominant party, say in Canada, the Liberal Party, it's dominant for years and years and years. Near the end of its time of dominance, you get a bunch of people who are joining the party not because they ideologically agree with it, not because they think it's the best way to govern the country, but because they think it's the best way to win and get in politics. And they want to be in politics because since they think it's so easy to win, they think it can be really easy to get away with corruption, enriching themselves. They're not really trying anymore. They don't really have to put any effort into it. They get complacent. They get corrupt. And it seems that about every 80 to 90 years, this corruption and complacency sets in deep enough and hard enough that it's replaced by a different government. One that is stridently not corrupt and one isn't complacent because I had to fight tooth and nail to win. Now, the crises that occur, such as the Great Depression or the Great Recession or COVID, possible World War III, those all propel it. Those are definitely factors that seriously matter. But arguably, the only reason these seriously matter is the corruption and complacency of the previous status quo. Now, the thing I will stress here is, again, I can't particularly prove this. In fact, you can't even really prove Strauss-Howe generation theory. It is a very compelling theory, and I think you should read into it. I definitely subscribe to the theory. Arguably, you could probably prove it just given time and just waiting to see if things keep following the cycle. But this is what it appears to be. And this appears how democratic systems work. You get the democratic revolution. Now, if you like this video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you think of the video. If you think if I'm crazy, if I went too deep, if you have any comments you want to make, like things you think I should add, things you think I should touch on, things you want me to expand upon in other videos, by all means. And if you, by all means, share this to all of your friends and press subscribe and all those things, all the YouTube analytics stuff, because it really helps the channel out, and all the help that I can get in spreading this kind of stuff is greatly appreciated. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week with more Path to Victory.